Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today going to be talking about the books that I've read this week. It was, again, a fun reading week. It's been a bit of a fun range, a few more non-fiction actually than usual, and I'll talk a little bit about them. But the non-fiction ones that I've really loved this week as well. But let's get started. I hope you've had a good week and let's get cracking. So first up, two books that sort of come as a bit of a two-for-one, but I'll do them separately. And the relationship between them will become apparent quite quickly, but I'll talk a little bit about that first. So the two books are Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking and Fleur Pierets' Julian, translated by Elisabeth. And the reason these two are connected is, well, for not the most pleasant of reasons, I guess, but essentially they are both to do with grief and loss. Starting this video off on a nice positive note this morning. Let's start off with Joan Didion. So The Year of Magical Thinking is a book I've had on my shelf for a few years now and just keep on meaning to read and haven't. Joan Didion, famous sort of big author who was sort of really, I think, changed the game in a lot of ways around her, how she kind of approached non-fiction. And The Year of Magical Thinking is her book dealing with the loss of her husband and then also her child within a very short amount of time. It's a book where she really tries to process what grief looks like. And it's really complex in many ways. Because she talks about, you know, how sometimes loss is just the absence of something that you're expecting, as in, you know, you go to call someone to tell them about something that happened and realize you can't, and how sometimes it's a sort of a much more, you know, a much bigger or more complex feeling of just wanting to hit things or whatever. And so I think Joan Didion does a really incredible job in finding words for her grief and for her loss in the darkest times. This is my first time reading Joan Didion, at least in sort of a whole book form instead of just a small essay, and I was really blown away by what she does here. I think this is a remarkable book. And it was one of those books that I'm really glad that I've now finally read this, and I really want to kind of hold on to this and read it again in future, particularly, you know, if anything unfortunate happens, you know. So it's just one of those books that manages to do that odd thing of being very impressive and sort of literary and whatever as a book itself, but also contains within its pages something really profound and true that you want to kind of hold on to. And so, linked to that is Julian by Fleur Pierets, translated by Elisabeth. And this book sort of name checks Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking a few times. But what this book does, I think, is also just really beautiful and profound in its own right. So it comes from a true story. Fleur was with her partner, her wife, Julian, and they had this really beautiful, happy marriage. They both they ran a company together, sort of sharing stories and talking about various things in the world, particularly around kind of queer rights or about kind of activism and things like that. And they sort of, just around the time that they were sort of getting married, sort of the first sort of time, Fleur sort of realized that Julian was quite unwell, and so what follows is this this really heartbreaking story of how Fleur and Julian try to find what they can to find joy in amongst all of this happening. And one of the things they decide to do is to get married in every country where same-sex marriage is legal at the time, and that is around 22 countries when they start, although it starts to get bigger as they go on. And they make it to about 4 countries before ultimately that's when Julian is too ill and unfortunately then passes away. So this book is kind of left as basically a way for Fleur to process her own grief, but also it's a much it goes way beyond that. I think the real strength of this book is just how beautiful it is. Obviously it's heartbreaking because of the nature of the story, but it really, you feel the love that she has for Julian on every single page. You feel the absolute pardon me, the absolute adoration she has for her. The little moments that they'll always be able to share and hold on to. It's really profound and stunning. And I think this book, especially as a nice little kind of sort of side, sort of, you know, running alongside Joan Didion's book, is just so beautiful in how it helps with this idea of how you process loss. At one point, she, you know, Joan Didion gives herself this sort of year of magical thinking. Fleur at one point gives herself 2, to sort of see what happens, and within 2 years, if she can have come to terms with her grief, not gotten over it, but kind of can come to terms with it. And I think there's something really beautiful about these two together. But I really think Fleur has written her socks off here. This is a stunning book that just, yeah, I just thought was really, really beautiful. Keeping with the non-fiction, and also not a particularly cheery one in some ways, A Working Class Family Ages Badly by Juno Roche. It's since been re-released under the name Rome, but it's the same book. And essentially this is Juno Roche writing her memoirs. And what happens within this book is really incredible, I think, in also many, many ways. Juno Roche is talking about her life as somebody who has faced down the barrel of addiction. She talks really candidly about addiction, about her HIV status. She talks really candidly as well about being trans and how all of these things collectively mean that she has had this very difficult kind of set of circumstances sometimes to sort of deal with. You know, she grew up in a working class family with a lot of violence around her, and that violence really marks itself in so many parts of her day-to-day life. And so parts of this book are really difficult to read for that reason. You know, we're talking some really quite harsh violence. It's a lot. However, I also think at the same time this book is incredibly wry and funny and clever. We see Juno Roche in her sort of later years being, you know, living near a mountain in Spain, and whereas sometimes that poses logistical issues. So COVID happens and she's trying to work out how she can get vaccinated so she can get back to the UK, so she can get her HIV medication topped up. All of these sorts of things. Also, at the same time, she's looking back over, you know, a really challenging life and thinking, I kind of made it. Here's me living in Spain. I've got my mum nearby who I love dearly. I've done okay. And it's a book that is just so profound in so many ways for all of that. But I also just sort of wanted to take a moment to kind of talk a little bit about the writing style, because at times this feels like Juno Roche has sort of, you know, she's sort of woken up in the morning, she's got her coffee, and she's just sort of typing out a few thoughts as they come to her, and then floats off and does something else, and then comes back later and does the same thing. Because there's almost this sort of episodic quality to it that I found really engaging. It feels very much like someone saying, well, this thing happened, and like, oh, well, this is on my mind, blah, 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 blah. And I've seen it done badly before in books where it's not really worked for me. In here, it really worked for me because it felt almost kind of conversational and sort of almost like, yeah, well, I'm just going to go back to my mountain, my little part of where I am in Spain. I'll maybe do a bit more writing later because it's tiring to remember these things. And not in a flippant way. I think just that this book, she's got so many memories to look back on. And so in some ways, her doing that episodic kind of quality makes total sense. And I think it really worked for me as a book because of that as well, because you'll have something utterly harrowing, but you're only in that moment for a short while. And then she wants to just remind you of where she is now, or she wants to talk about her dogs or something else. And this, I just think, is a really incredible book that I think is one of those ones where, I don't know, I feel like this is a really important memoir for many, many reasons. And I think it's a very, very well done book. So a book that's not non-fiction and is very different in many ways. Margaret Atwood's Old Babes in the Woods. So this is a collection of short stories, and I really love Atwood's work. even a sort of I was going to say a bad Atwood, even a less good Atwood, I still would happily spend a lot of time in. And I think the Old Babes in the Wood is a pretty decent Atwood. So this is a selection of short stories, and they're sort of split into different sections. So the first section is sort of 2 stories around this married couple. And their sort of quirks and foibles, and we come back to them for the last section of the book. And in the middle are these short stories that are about other characters. At one point, there's a short story just about cats. because Margaret Atwood, there are these sort of weird and wonderful things where the ones that focus on the couple tend to be slightly more in the realm of reality, I guess. They're very very much the tales of how a couple interact with each other. And there's something also quite poignant about that too, with Margaret Atwood in recent years having lost her husband. And so, I mean, maybe reading too much into it, but the focus on this couple to kind of bookend this set of stories also does feel like a slight sense of her reaching out and kind of finding that kind of communion again with a partner. But in the middle, we have cats and we have weird and wonderful things happening. I mean, short stories are normally, so in terms of the Atwood metaverse, I normally sort of novels and her poems I normally have a bit higher up, and some of her short stories I really like. I enjoyed this set of stories. I didn't necessarily like love it, but I still greatly enjoyed it because it's Atwood and she can write incredibly well. So even this short story about the cat that I'll stop going on about, but it is just one of those things that feels so Atwood to have something so absurd, but her to kind of lean into that absurdity and just revel in telling you a story about these kind of imperious cats. It's good fun. And so I think if you enjoy Atwood, I think you'll also definitely enjoy this. And I think these are really thoughtful short stories, including some beautiful reflections on love and relationships, that I just thought was also just really quite beautiful. Next up, I read The List by Yomi Adegoke. And this is a novel that really focuses on a few kind of big hot button issues, I guess. So it focuses a lot on this idea of cancel culture and accountability, around sort of internet culture, but also a lot around sexism and sort of sexual violence and a few other things. It centers on these 2 characters, more specifically Michael and Ola, and their relationship. And basically this is thrown into disarray when there is an anonymous list posted on Twitter. Also kind of funny side point to have Twitter referenced so much through a book, and probably just after this book came out it would have switched to X. And so all these this is I won't get into that whole discussion, but sort of something quite interesting about being like, well, technically it's no longer a retweet, but there we go. But that's also in some ways partly the point, right? Internet culture can be so quickly changing and can move at such a pace. But the idea is this list is posted on Twitter, and it contains the names of several men who it is alleged have committed some form of sexual violence or harassment or what have you. And the list also features one of the named characters, Michael, at the beginning. And so the book sort of goes into this discussion about how this couple deal with it. They're both media types. They both work in media in some form, sort of whether podcasting in Michael's sort of sense, or whether in terms of like writing articles, which is more what Ola does. And so then the book really examines through various perspectives. So how friends and family respond to the news. And I heard an interview with Yomi afterwards where she was talking about this, and she was saying that often the discussion is what happens to the men's careers when this happens, or what happens to the people who are victims of all of this, and maybe less so the partners, the friends and family, the wider network around those people. And so I think this book does a really interesting job in exploring some of those parts. And it's a very sort of pacey book. It's very thrillery in the way that you are kind of burning through it to try and get to what is happening. And I will say, I think it explores a few of those nuances in quite interesting ways. So playing with this idea of, for some of the characters, and I don't want to spoil things, but for some of the characters, what their motivations might be to either put people on the list or to deny everything about being on the list. And that's kind of the also part of the grey area that the book presents, because for a great deal of the book, we are not fully sure how innocent some of the characters are. Michael, we're told from the beginning, because we partly have the book in his perspective, he is completely like, well, no, I did none of this. This is all speculation. Some things are revealed where we learn that he's less than great with women, or has been at times. But again, the book then kind of questions, would any of this be enough to tip over into this? Is this sort of general poor behavior in terms of poor communication, or has he been actually violent? And not to say that those two things are the same, but more kind of, there are certain things that he might remember, and other characters seem to remember differently. So the book plays a lot with some of those ideas. And so, yeah, just, I don't want to call it a fun read, because it's not in terms of the content, but it's a very quick read in that sense of sort of, it's very much a book that you, kind of, yeah, thrillery, kind of very quick, kind of get through the story, kind of book. It's very pacey and plotty in that sense. So I think it's a fun and engaging one, particularly for things like book clubs or for sort of big discussions to have afterwards as well. And last but not least, I read Twan Eng's The Gift of Rain. So he's 3 for 3 at the moment, with having been longlisted for the Booker, The Gift of Rain being his first book. And this book in many ways sort of hits a few of the same points that you'd expect from some of his other books. He talks a lot about, for example, empire, occupation, colonialism, and a few other things, particularly kind of Malaysia's history and how that often, it's been a very complicated history, it's safe to say, for Malaysia in terms of various bits of colonialism and invasion, not only from the British, but also from the Japanese and from various other countries over its history. And so Malaysia has this very complex history that is often one of trying to assert a Malaysianness against, and that having to be something that is resistance against sort of an invader. And so this book deals a lot with that, and particularly, there's at one point a Japanese sword, and there's this kind of thing of, a Japanese weapon, something that is part of a history of a country that has invaded Malaysia, but is also held in this reverence because it was given as a gift, and all of these other complicated things. But this book deals especially with these kind of conflicts. It deals a lot with empire and with colonialism in quite big ways. But at the heart of it, we have this character who is trying to just navigate his way through all of this in this incredibly tricksy and complicated world. And he, as the title of the book suggests, is sort of told at a young age that he has the gift of rain, and he sees that as him being a sign of ill fortune and him being this curse, essentially. And the book kind of looks and explores the ways that he is kind of there when all the bad stuff happens, but is also potentially a sign of hope as well. So just like Twan Eng's books, I've read his 3, and they are all sumptuously written and stunning. I think he's also got some really intelligent things to say about empire and colonialism. He explores it from a very interesting place as sort of being in a country that was colonized, but also exploring the kinds of relationships that country can then have with the powers that have invaded. And so it's, I think, as with all of his writing, very beautiful, very subtle at times, very clever. And he's just an endlessly interesting writer for me. I think he just does something really beautiful with language and with his sort of plot construction, I think. And anyway, that brings me to the end of the books that I've read this week. I hope you've had a really good week. Apologies, I realise I've been a little bit like blah, 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 as I'm talking. It's in the morning as I'm filming this because I'm about to run off and go and do something. And I'm away over the weekend, so I'm filming this very quickly now on a Friday morning. But I hope you're all doing really, really well. I hope you have a wonderful week and you've had a good week of reading as well. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.